You used to be more expressive, more animated, more reactive, more quick to respond. If something irritated you, it showed. If something excited you, it was visible. If you disagreed, you said it immediately. Now there's a pause. You listen longer. You react less. You don't feel the same urgency to speak. And sometimes that pause unsettles you. You wonder, am I becoming distant? Am I losing my personality? Why don't I react like I used to? From the outside, it might even look like withdrawal. People may comment on it. You're quiet lately. You seem different. You don't talk as much. And because you remember how expressive you once were, you question yourself. But look carefully. Are you suppressing yourself? Or are you simply less reactive? There's a difference. Carl Jung observed that much of what we call personality is initially built from adaptation. The ego forms around survival strategies, ways of being to help us secure belonging, recognition, or safety. If you grew up needing to assert yourself, you became expressive. If you grew up needing to defend yourself, you became reactive. If you grew up needing attention to feel visible, you became animated. Those traits weren't random. They were protective. But as consciousness increases, unconscious protection softens. Jung believed that individuation reduces unconscious possession. When you are unconsciously possessed by a trait, anger, enthusiasm, dominance, charm, it operates automatically. It feels like you. But when awareness expands, you are no longer fully possessed by those impulses. You experience them, but you are not driven by them. That creates space. And space looks like silence. Earlier, if someone challenged you, your reaction was immediate. Now, you notice the impulse, but you don't always act on it. Earlier, if a room felt tense, you filled it with energy. Now, you can tolerate silence without needing to control it. Earlier, disagreement required resolution. Now, it doesn't always require engagement. That reduction in urgency can feel like loss, because intensity is easy to recognize. Stillness is subtle. You may even miss your old fire, the sharpness, the quickness, the emotional charge. But ask yourself honestly, was that fire always strength, or was it sometimes defense? Jung warned that when the ego over-identifies with certain traits, those traits become exaggerated. Exaggeration feels powerful, but it is often compensation. As integration deepens, compensation relaxes. And when compensation relaxes, behavior becomes measured. Measured behavior is quieter. You are not less intelligent, not less passionate, not less capable. You are less compelled to prove, less compelled to dominate, less compelled to explain. That reduction in compulsion feels strange at first, because your identity may have been tied to expression. If you were the outspoken one, silence feels like disappearance. If you were the energetic one, calm feels like loss. But calm is not absence. It is regulation. Jung emphasized the importance of integrating opposites. The expressive person must integrate silence. The dominant person must integrate receptivity. The reactive person must integrate restraint. When you integrate the opposite of your dominant trait, your behavior stabilizes. But stabilization feels unfamiliar. You may notice that conversations feel different now. You observe more. You analyze less externally. You don't feel the same need to insert yourself into every dynamic. That doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It means you are choosing when to say it. Choice replaces impulse. And impulse reduction feels like personality reduction, but it isn't. It's ego stabilization. There's also a nervous system component here. As you mature psychologically, your nervous system becomes less reactive. Earlier, small provocations triggered strong responses. Now, the same stimuli produce milder reactions. That's not suppression. It's regulation. But if you are used to feeling alive through intensity, regulation can feel flat at first. You may interpret it as boredom or distance, but often it is simply steadiness. Jung once wrote that the pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. Earlier, your pendulum may have swung widely. High highs, sharp reactions, strong assertions. Now, the swing is narrower, less extreme, more centered, and centered feels quieter than extreme. You might also notice that you are less interested in performing your personality. Earlier, you may have exaggerated humor, amplified opinions, projected energy. Now, performance feels unnecessary. Presence replaces performance, and presence is calm. This shift can create temporary social discomfort. Others may expect the old version of you. They may try to pull you back into familiar roles. But returning to unconscious exaggeration feels forced now because you've seen it. And once you see a pattern, you cannot fully return to being possessed by it. You may worry that becoming quieter means becoming invisible. But visibility driven by compulsion is not the same as visibility driven by authenticity. You are not disappearing. You are reducing excess. Jung believed that psychological development moves toward wholeness, not extremity. Wholeness contains intensity, but it is not dominated by it. Wholeness contains silence, but it is not defined by absence. Right now, you may be integrating silence into a personality that was once loud. And integration feels like subtraction before it feels like balance. The key distinction is this. Are you quiet because you are afraid? Or are you quiet because you no longer feel the need to react? Fear-based silence feels constricted. Regulated silence feels grounded. Only you can sense the difference internally. If the quiet feels stable, not tense, then it is likely growth. You are not losing personality. You are losing exaggeration. And exaggeration is not identity. It is adaptation. As adaptation softens, essence remains. Essence does not need to dominate space. It simply occupies it. Right now, your presence may feel less dramatic, but it may also feel more contained, more deliberate, more conscious. And that shift, though subtle, signals psychological consolidation. You are not fading. You are stabilizing. And stabilization is quieter than intensity, but far more durable. There's something important to understand about your old expressiveness. It wasn't random. It served a purpose. Maybe you were quick to speak because silence once felt unsafe. Maybe you reacted strongly because you needed to protect your position. Maybe you filled space because invisibility once felt threatening. Most dominant personality traits begin as adaptations. Carl Jung made this clear when he spoke about the persona, the social face we construct to navigate the world. The persona is not fake. It is functional. But when we over-identify with it, we begin to believe it is our whole self. If you were the outspoken one, that role likely stabilized your ego at some point in life. It gave you recognition, control, identity. But individuation requires that the ego loosen its rigid attachment to these roles. And when it does, the exaggeration fades. You may now notice something subtle. You don't feel the same urgency to correct people. You don't feel the same need to dominate conversations. You don't feel compelled to explain yourself endlessly. That doesn't mean you've lost your voice. It means your voice is no longer compensatory. Earlier, speaking may have been tied to validation. Now, speaking is tied to intention. Earlier, reacting may have been tied to ego defense. Now, responding is tied to proportion. This shift feels quieter because it is less driven by unconscious need. Jung warned that when we are possessed by a complex, whether the power complex, an inferiority complex, or a need for approval complex, our behavior becomes exaggerated. We think we're simply expressing ourselves, but in reality, we're being driven. As consciousness increases, possession decreases. And when possession decreases, reactivity softens. You are not suppressing yourself. You are no longer compelled. Compulsion is loud. Freedom is measured. This is why maturity often looks like silence. Silence is not emptiness. It is self-containment. Earlier, silence might have felt tense. Now, silence feels neutral. You can sit in a group and observe without needing to assert. You can let a misunderstanding pass without feeling attacked. You can disagree internally without needing immediate external resolution. This capacity signals ego stabilization. Jung believed that a stable ego is not one that dominates, but one that relates consciously to its impulses. You still feel irritation. You still feel excitement. You still feel conviction. but you are not governed by them. And when impulses are no longer governing you, your behavior becomes less dramatic. That reduction in drama can feel like dullness if you're used to intensity. But intensity is not vitality. Often, intensity was nervous system activation, heightened states, fast reactions, emotional spikes. As the nervous system regulates, those spikes reduce. You may feel less alive in an exaggerated sense, but more grounded in a stable sense. Earlier, a room's energy could pull you in instantly. Now, you remain internally anchored. Earlier, someone's tone could trigger immediate defense. Now, you evaluate before reacting. This is psychological differentiation. Jung emphasized that individuation requires separating from collective patterns. When you are less unconsciously influenced by group dynamics, you appear quieter because you are no longer reacting to every emotional fluctuation in the room. You may also notice that you don't argue the same way. You don't escalate as easily. You don't feel the same need to win. Earlier, debate may have reinforced your identity. Now, understanding matters more than victory. And understanding is quieter than domination. There's also something else happening. You are becoming less invested in impression management. Earlier, you may have amplified humor, intelligence, or intensity to secure a position. Now, you are less attached to being perceived in a specific way. And when attachment to perception decreases, performance decreases. Performance is loud. Presence is calm. Jung wrote about the danger of identifying too strongly with the persona. When we cling to a social mask, we become one-sided. Individuation requires pulling energy back from that mask and redistributing it inward. When energy returns inward, outward behavior softens. You can serve rather than project. You choose rather than react. You speak when aligned rather than when triggered. From the outside, this can look like withdrawal, but internally it feels stable. The question to ask yourself is this: does your quiet feel constricted, or does it feel grounded? Constricted silence feels like fear. Grounded silence feels like strength. You are not shrinking. You are consolidating. Consolidation always appears less dramatic than expansion, but it is more durable. Earlier, you may have been in an expansion phase, building identity, asserting self, establishing boundaries loudly. Now you may be in a consolidation phase, refining identity, stabilizing ego, integrating opposites. Jung believed that real power is not domination, but integration, and integration reduces the need for display. When you no longer need to prove, you naturally speak less. When you no longer need to defend, you naturally react less. When you no longer need to impress, you naturally perform less. And when performance decreases, quiet increases. This quiet is not absence. It is containment. You still have depth. You still have intensity. But it is internally organized rather than externally projected. That organization makes you appear calmer. And calm can feel unfamiliar if you were used to being expressive. But calm is not emptiness. It is integration in action. At some point, you realize something important. You are not quieter because you have less to say. You are quieter because you no longer feel the need to say everything. That distinction changes everything. Earlier, expression may have been immediate. Thought became speech. Emotion became reaction. Tension became confrontation. There was very little space between impulse and action. Now there is space, and space feels like silence. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity involves withdrawing projections and integrating unconscious material. When you are less projected outward, more energy remains contained within the psyche. That containment reduces compulsive expression. You still feel, but you don't discharge immediately. You still think, but you don't externalize every conclusion. You still disagree, but you don't always need to engage. This is not suppression. Suppression feels tight, rigid, fear-based. Integration feels steady, flexible, deliberate. Earlier, silence may have felt threatening. Now, silence feels neutral. You can sit in a conversation without filling every gap. You can let someone misunderstand you temporarily without rushing to correct it. You can hear something you disagree with and evaluate whether engagement is necessary. That evaluation process is new, and because it slows you down, it makes you appear quieter. Jung described the development of consciousness as creating separation between ego and impulse. The more conscious you become, the less you are possessed by emotional complexes. Possession is loud. Consciousness is measured. You may notice that your emotional spikes have reduced. High highs are softer. Low lows are shorter. Your nervous system doesn't surge as intensely. Earlier, intensity may have felt like passion. Now, steadiness feels like depth. But if you were accustomed to living in emotional spikes, steadiness can feel flat at first. It isn't flat. It's regulated. Regulation is not dullness. It is stability. There's also less urgency in you now. Less urgency to be understood. Less urgency to win. Less urgency to dominate space. Urgency was often tied to ego reinforcement, to proving identity. As identity stabilizes internally, urgency decreases. And without urgency, speech decreases. You speak when it matters, not to reinforce self-image. Jung warned that when we over-identify with persona, we become inflated by it. Inflated personas demand attention. They demand recognition. They demand reinforcement. As individuation progresses, inflation deflates. And when inflation deflates, presence replaces projection. Presence is quiet. Presence does not need volume. It does not need constant output. It does not need to convince. You may notice something subtle in group settings. You observe more than you intervene. You read dynamics more than you control them. You feel less compelled to manage the emotional climate. That is strength. Earlier, you may have felt responsible for how every interaction unfolded. Now, you allow space for others to carry their own reactions. That alone reduces verbal output significantly. You're no longer overfunctioning. You are relating proportionately. There may also be a shift in what stimulates you. Superficial banter may feel less energizing. Performative debates may feel unnecessary. You may crave depth rather than volume. Depth requires listening. Listening increases silence. And silence can feel like loss if you equated identity with expressiveness. But expression without integration is noise. Expression after integration is precise. You may speak less, but when you do, it carries weight. That is consolidation. Jung believed that the goal of individuation is wholeness, not dominance. Wholeness does not need to compete for space. It occupies space naturally. You are not shrinking. You are refining. Refinement removes excess. Excess was loud. Refinement is focused. There's also a subtle emotional maturity here. Earlier, disagreement felt personal. Now it feels contextual. Earlier, silence felt like rejection. Now it feels like neutrality. Earlier, being overlooked felt threatening. Now it feels tolerable. That tolerance reduces reactive expression. And reactive expression was once a large part of your visible personality. You are not losing personality. You are losing reactivity. And reactivity is not identity. It is nervous system habit. As the nervous system stabilizes, outward behavior stabilizes. Stability looks quiet compared to volatility, but stability is strength. The question to ask yourself is simple. Do you feel smaller or more grounded? If you feel smaller, something may be suppressed. If you feel grounded, something has integrated. Only you can sense that difference internally. If the quiet feels stable, if it feels chosen rather than forced, then it is likely growth. You are not disappearing. You are containing yourself. And containment is a sign that the ego no longer needs constant external reinforcement. It trusts its internal structure. That trust reduces volume. And when volume decreases, presence increases. Presence is subtle, but powerful. If you are quieter than you used to be, don't rush to fix it. Don't assume you've lost your personality. Don't assume you become distant. Don't assume something is wrong. Ask a better question. Does this quiet feel heavy, or does it feel grounded? Carl Jung understood that as consciousness expands, unconscious reactivity decreases. What once erupted automatically becomes observed. What once demanded expression becomes chosen. And choice is quieter than impulse. You are not less passionate. You are less possessed. You are not less strong. You are less defensive. You are not less expressive. You are less compelled. Earlier, your energy may have moved outward quickly. Now, it circulates internally before it moves. That internal circulation feels like silence, but silence is not emptiness. It is containment. Jung warned that when we are ruled by unconscious complexes, we mistake reactivity for authenticity. True authenticity emerges only after integration, after the ego stabilizes and no longer needs to dominate space. Maturity often looks like reduced urgency, reduced argument, reduced performance, reduced exaggeration. But reduction is not diminishment. It is refinement. You speak less, but with more intention. You react less, but with more clarity. You assert less, but with more stability. That is not shrinking. That is consolidation. The world may reward loudness, but psychological wholeness does not require volume. It requires alignment. If your quiet feels steady, if it feels chosen rather than forced, then you are not withdrawing. You are integrating. And integration is rarely dramatic. It is subtle, stable, self-contained. You are not fading into the background. You are standing without needing to prove that you are standing. And that kind of presence, calm, deliberate, contained, is not weaker than your former intensity. It is stronger. Quieter does not mean smaller. It means you no longer need noise to feel real. And that is psychological maturity in motion,